When people imagine medieval kitchens, they often picture roaring hearths, hearty stews, and cheerful servants preparing rustic meals. The reality was far less romantic. Medieval kitchens were among the dirtiest, most dangerous, and most disease-ridden spaces in any household, from peasant huts to noble castles. They were places of smoke, rot, insects, animal waste, and constant risk to life and health. Food was prepared not in clean, controlled environments, but in conditions that modern hygiene would consider shocking. First, consider the physical structure of a medieval kitchen. Most kitchens were dark, poorly ventilated rooms dominated by an open hearth or fire pit. Chimneys were rare before the late Middle Ages, so smoke filled the room, blackening walls, ceilings, and lungs. Soot clung to everything: pots, food, hands, hair. Cooks inhaled it daily, leading to chronic coughing, lung disease, and early death. The walls were often bare stone or rough wood, impossible to clean and perfect for harboring bacteria, mold, and insects. Clean water was another major problem. Kitchens rarely had direct access to fresh running water. Water had to be hauled in buckets from wells, rivers, or communal sources, many of which were already contaminated by human and animal waste. This same water was used for washing hands, rinsing vegetables, cleaning utensils, and sometimes diluting soups or drinks. If the water was foul, and often it was, every step of food preparation spread disease further. Utensils and cookware were crude by modern standards. Wooden bowls, spoons, and cutting boards were common. But wood absorbs moisture, blood, and grease. Without soap as we know it today, these tools were wiped clean at best, not properly washed. Cracks and grooves became breeding grounds for bacteria. Metal pots were expensive and reused endlessly, often without thorough cleaning. Grease and burnt residue accumulated over years, turning cookware into permanent sources of contamination. Food storage was equally grim. Refrigeration did not exist. Meat was hung in kitchens or nearby rooms, exposed to flies, dust, and rodents. In warm weather, it spoiled quickly. To mask the taste and smell of rotting meat, cooks relied heavily on salt, vinegar, garlic, onions, and strong spices when available. Contrary to popular belief, spices were not primarily used to hide rot among the poor. Most peasants could not afford them, but even wealthy households struggled to keep food fresh. Rodents were everywhere. Rats and mice moved freely through kitchens, feeding on scraps, gnawing at stored grain, and defecating wherever they pleased. Their droppings fell into flour bins, onto cutting surfaces, and sometimes directly into cooking pots. Cats helped somewhat, but they too walked across counters and food, carrying dirt and parasites on their paws. Fleas, lice, and mites were constant companions. Insects were unavoidable. Flies swarmed over meat, fish, bread, and fruit. They laid eggs, which hatched into maggots within days, or hours in summer heat. It was common practice to scrape maggots off meat and cook it anyway, especially in times of scarcity. Bread often contained weevils, and flour was sifted not to remove dirt, but to reduce the number of visible insects. Total removal was impossible. Waste management was primitive. Kitchen scraps were often thrown onto the floor during cooking and later swept outside or fed to animals. In many homes, animals such as chickens, pigs, or dogs wandered in and out of the kitchen freely. They ate leftovers, relieved themselves on the floor, and sometimes became dinner themselves. Blood from slaughtered animals could pool on the ground, mixed with ash, grease, and dirt. Personal hygiene among kitchen workers was minimal. Regular bathing was rare, especially in colder months. Hands were not washed frequently, and there was no understanding of germs. A cook might handle raw meat, scratch an infected wound, wipe sweat from their face, and knead bread without pause. Cuts and burns were common, often becoming infected. These infections could ooze or fester while the person continued working directly over food. The heat of the kitchen made everything worse. Fires burned constantly, raising temperatures and accelerating decay. Sweat dripped into pots, food spoiled faster, flies multiplied. In summer, the smell could be overwhelming, a mixture of smoke, rot, human bodies, animal waste, and stagnant water. Kitchens were not just unpleasant, they were genuinely hazardous environments. Food poisoning was common, though it was not understood as such. People blamed bad humors, curses, or divine punishment for illness after meals. Diarrhea, vomiting, and fever were regular occurrences. Children, the elderly, and the poor were especially vulnerable. Outbreaks of disease could sweep through households simply from a shared meal prepared in a contaminated kitchen. Even in castles, conditions were not much better. While noble kitchens were larger and had more staff, they also prepared food in huge quantities, increasing the risk of spoilage and contamination. Large cauldrons of stew might sit for hours or days, reheated repeatedly. Each reheating killed some bacteria, but did not eliminate toxins already produced by decay. Leftovers were common, and food was rarely discarded unless completely inedible. Medieval kitchens were a reflection of their time, practical, brutal, and indifferent to comfort or cleanliness. Survival mattered more than sanitation. People accepted filth as a normal part of life because they had no alternative and no scientific understanding of its dangers. What seems horrifying today was simply routine then. The next time medieval feasts are depicted as warm and wholesome, it is worth remembering the truth. Behind the stone walls and flickering firelight was a world of smoke-choked rooms, crawling insects, contaminated food, and constant risk of sickness. Medieval kitchens did not nourish health. They merely kept people alive, and sometimes not even that. Close your eyes now. Let the darkness of your own room blend with the shadows of the past. Imagine a heavy oak door creaking open on rusted iron hinges, revealing a space that smells of ancient charcoal and scorched fat. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, step inside. The air here is not empty. It is a physical weight, thick and grey. We are standing in the center of a 12th century manor kitchen, a structure built of cold stone and rough timber. And the first thing your body registers is the sting. Your eyes water instantly, a reflexive defense against the acrid cloud that hangs suspended in the room. In this era, the elegant chimney stacks that will later dot the skylines of Europe are largely a dream of the future. Instead, we have the open hearth, a roaring beast of a fire placed squarely in the center of the earthen floor. Look up through the haze. High above, there is a simple hole in the roof, perhaps covered by a wooden louver or a ceramic pot with the bottom knocked out, intended to siphon the smoke away. But the wind is capricious tonight. It pushes the smoke back down, trapping it within these four walls, creating a suffocating layer known as the smother. The kitchen staff, silhouettes moving through the gloom, have learned to walk with a permanent stoop, keeping their heads below the thickest plumes of grey, bowing eternally to the fire that sustains them. It is a wonder they don't come out looking like smoked herrings, preserved and tough. Though I suppose, in a way, they are. Historians still argue about the exact rate of respiratory failure in these environments, but archaeological evidence from skeletal remains often shows darkened, carbon-stained ribs, suggesting that for the kitchen serf, every breath was a tiny intake of poison. The walls themselves tell the story of this slow suffocation. They are not merely shadowed. They are coated in a substance called fuligino, a glossy, tar-like varnish formed from decades of soot, mixing with the vaporized grease of roasting meats. If you were to reach out and touch the stone, your fingers would come away sticky and black, marked by the residue of 10,000 dinners. There is no scrubbing this clean. To clean the walls would be to strip the building down to its skeleton. So the filth remains, layer upon layer, a geological record of crime that absorbs the faint, flickering light of the embers. The only illumination comes from the fire itself, casting long, frantic shadows that dance against the soot like goblins, distorting the shapes of the hanging pots and the bundles of drying herbs until they look like withered hands reaching down from the rafters. It is a sensory assault, a place where the romantic image of the cozy hearth dies, choked out by the reality of a room that cannot breathe. Here, in the dim light, safety is an illusion, and the simple act of preparing a meal is a battle against the elements, fought within a stone box that remembers every fire it has ever held. Step away from the stinging smoke now, pushing through the heavy oak door into the courtyard where the air is cooler, though not necessarily sweeter. To understand the medieval kitchen, one must understand the lifeline that fed it, the liquid spine of every meal, the water. We follow a figure hunched under the weight of a wooden yoke, a servant whose existence is defined by the rhythm of the bucket and the well. This is the water carrier, often the lowest-ranking member of the household staff, a human mule whose labor is invisible until the supply runs dry. In the grand tapestry of history, kings are remembered for their wars and knights for their chivalry. But civilization truly rested on the shoulders of the man who hauled gallons of liquid up a muddy hill without spilling a drop. The journey begins at the source, and here lies the first silent tragedy of the medieval diet. In an ideal world, or perhaps a monastic fantasy, water would be drawn from a sparkling, deep-dug well, protected by stone copings and blessed by a saint. And indeed, many castles had their own wells, sometimes sunk hundreds of feet into the bedrock to ensure a siege could be withstood. But for the vast majority of urban households and manors, the source was the local river, or a communal public conduit. Let us walk down to the riverbank with our carrier. The ground here is slick with clay and refuse, sucking at leather boots with a wet, squelching sound. The water moves sluggishly, thick with the effluent of a growing population. Just upstream, we might see the dyeworks of the cloth merchants, turning the current a bruised purple or a sickly yellow. A little further up, the tanners are soaking hides in urine and lime, a pungent cocktail that drifts downstream to mingle with the washerwomen scrubbing linens on the rocks. And everywhere, of course, the latrines of the city empty their contents directly into the flow. It is a dual-function system, where the city's beverage dispenser is also its toilet, a level of multitasking that modern urban planning has, thankfully, abandoned. Yet, this is the water that fills the buckets. As the carrier dips the wooden pail into the grey swirl, pushing aside a floating patch of scum, they are not thinking of bacteria, a concept as alien to them as space travel, but of weight. Water is heavy. A full bucket weighs roughly 20 pounds, and our carrier balances 2, sometimes 4, trudging back and forth, until their shoulders are rubbed raw and their spine is permanently compressed. It is an endless, Sisyphus-like penance, for a busy kitchen consumes water with a thirst that cannot be slaked. It is needed for the cauldrons, for scrubbing the stone floors, for scalding the feathers off chickens, and for washing the hands of the Lord before he eats. There is a persistent myth that we must gently dismantle here. The idea that medieval people never drank water because they knew it was dangerous, preferring only ale or wine. While it is true that fermented drinks were safer and preferred for their calories, water was still consumed in vast quantities by the poor and used constantly in cooking. If the soup stock is 90% river water, the ale doesn't matter much. Historians still argue regarding the specific purification methods used by commoners. While medical texts of the time, such as those by the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, advised boiling water to thin it or filtering it through clean linen, it is unclear how often a tired kitchen maid actually performed these extra steps when the master was shouting for his dinner. Most likely, the water went straight from the bucket to the pot, carrying with it the microscopic biota of the entire city. Imagine the bucket now, hauled back into the kitchen, sloshing over the rim to hiss against the hot stones of the hearth. The cook dips a ladle into it. If the water is particularly turbid, they might let it sit for a while so the heavier grit settles to the bottom. A primitive filtration system that does absolutely nothing for the invisible pathogens swimming happily in the suspended gloom. This water is then splashed over the vegetables, effectively coating the turnips and carrots in a thin film of the river's history. It is poured into the iron pot to boil the beef. Here, we encounter a small mercy of physics. The long, slow cooking times required for tough medieval meats likely killed off the worst of the bacteria, like cholera or typhoid. However, the water used to quickly rinse a goblet or wash a salad of leafy greens offered no such protection. The salad, incidentally, was often seen with suspicion by physicians of the time, who believed raw vegetables generated wind and melancholy. And given the water they were washed in, the resulting stomach aches were likely not just from the fiber. The relationship between the kitchen and its water source was a cycle of contamination. The dirty water from scrubbing the floor or washing dishes, greasy grey dishwater, had to go somewhere. In many kitchens, it was simply tossed out the back door into a gutter or a soak-away pit, which, depending on the geology of the area, might very well seep right back into the shallow well from which the water was drawn. It was a closed loop of biological hazard. Yet, the water carrier trudges on, unaware of the microscopic empire he transports. He knows only the bite of the rope into his hands and the ache in his lower back. He delivers the buckets to a large cistern or a lead-lined trough in the corner of the kitchen, a holding tank that is rarely, if ever, scrubbed out. Algae might bloom softly on the lead sides, green and slippery, adding a certain earthy terroir to the water that no amount of expensive saffron could quite mask. In the winter, this trough might freeze over, requiring the cook to break the ice with a cleaver. In the summer, it becomes a lukewarm breeding ground for mosquitoes. But water is life, even when it is dirty. Without it, the kitchen stops. The dried peas cannot be softened. The salt fish cannot be soaked to make it palatable, and the fires cannot be controlled. The water carrier puts down his load, wiping sweat from his brow with a hand that has touched the river mud, the bucket handle, and the stable door. He takes a ladle, dips it into the bucket he just hauled, the water cool and tempting despite its journey, and drinks deep. It is a game of Russian roulette played with a ladle, but he is thirsty, and the ale is locked in the buttery. The water travels down, cool against the throat, settling in the stomach where the real history of the medieval kitchen will be written. Not in books, but in the fevers and cramps that follow the feast. The bucket is empty now. He turns, picks up the yoke, and heads back out into the light, back to the riverbank, where the tanners are scraping hides, and the cycle begins anew. Move your gaze now from the water trough to the darkest, dampest corner of the room, a place where the shadows seem to pool like spilled ink. This is the domain of the scullion, the lowest rung on the kitchen's rigid social ladder. If the cook is the king of this hot, smoky kingdom, the scullion is the serf of the soil, bound to the dirt and the grease. In many great houses, these workers are children, boys known as turnspits or gallopins, or sometimes older men and women, broken by years of labor, their knees permanently bent from crouching over the washing tubs. Their soundtrack is not the crackle of the fire or the chop of the knife, but the relentless, grinding rasp of sand against metal. It is a sound like a heavy breath, shkur, shkur, repeating endlessly into the night. We often imagine that medieval people didn't care about cleanliness, but that isn't entirely true. They cared about appearance. A silver platter had to shine to reflect the Lord's glory, and a copper pot had to gleam to show the household's wealth. But the hygiene of the invisible, the microbial cleanliness, is a battle the scullion is destined to lose. Watch the boy in the corner. He is tackling a cauldron that recently held a beef stew for 40 people. The vessel is massive, iron-heavy, and crusted with a thick ring of blackened gravy and burnt onions. There is no bottle of lemon-scented detergent here, no degreasing spray that dissolves fat with a chemical hiss. His toolkit is primitive and abrasive. He reaches into a bucket of river sand, sharp, gritty, and free, and throws a handful into the pot. Next comes a bundle of scouring rushes or horsetail, a plant naturally rich in silica, which acts like nature's steel wool. He adds a splash of the murky water we saw earlier, perhaps mixed with a little wood ash. The ash contains lye, which, when mixed with the animal fat in the pot, creates a crude, harsh soap right there on the metal. It is chemistry in its rawest form. As he scrubs, the lye bites into his hands, stripping away the natural oils of his skin, along with the beef tallow. His knuckles are red, cracked, and weeping, a condition so common it barely registers as an injury. It is simply the texture of his life. The grease he fights is tenacious. Medieval cooking relies heavily on animal fats, lard, tallow, butter, which solidify into a waxy, waterproof coating the moment the temperature drops. The water in his tub is lukewarm at best, cooling rapidly in the drafty room. Have you ever tried to wash a butter dish in cold water? The fat doesn't dissolve. It smears. It coats the hands, the brush, and the sides of the tub in a grey, slippery film. The scullion scrubs until the visible chunks of food are gone, until the metal feels smooth to the touch. But the microscopic layer of lipid remains, trapping bacteria against the iron surface. This pot will be rinsed, cursory, quick, and then stacked on the floor or a low shelf, ready for the next day's meal. Historians have long debated the efficacy of these cleaning methods. Some argue that the residual layer of fat acted as a sealant, preventing rust, much like seasoning a modern cast iron skillet. Others point out that unlike a modern skillet, which is heated until the oil polymerizes, these pots were often left with raw, rancid fat sitting in the pores of the metal, turning rancid and harboring pathogens that would be reawakened by the next day's gentle warming. But the metal pots are the easy part. The true nightmare of the scullion is the woodenware. Look at the stack of trenchers and bowls waiting for him. Wood is a sponge. It drinks. Every ladle of gravy, every trickle of blood from a rare steak, every wipe of a saliva-dampened crumb seeps into the grain of the wood. The scullion cannot boil these bowls. They would warp and split. He cannot soak them for too long. They would rot. So he scrapes. He takes a small, dull knife and physically shaves off the top layer of wood that has been soaked with the previous meal. It is a process of erosion. Over time, the trenchers become thin and concave, worn down by the friction of cleaning. But the knife cannot reach deep into the cracks and knife cuts left by the diners. In those microscopic ravines, tiny colonies of bacteria thrive, feeding on the trapped organic matter, waiting for the next hot meal to incubate them. When a lord falls ill with a flux of the belly, he might blame a witch or a misalignment of Mars, never suspecting his favorite wooden bowl. There is a strange economic tension here in the scullery as well. The grease that the scullion scrapes away is not just waste. It is a commodity. This filthy blackened fat, known as kitchen stuff or slush, has value. It can be sold to candle makers to create cheap tallow dips, the smelly, sputtering candles used by the poor, or used to grease axle wheels. In royal households, the slush is the perquisite of the master cook, a way to line his pockets. This is the origin of the modern term slush fund, money skimmed off the top for illicit or side purposes. The scullion must be careful. If he washes too much of the grease down the drain, he is wasting the cook's bonus. If he leaves too much on the pot, he is beaten for laziness. He walks a fine line between hygiene and profit, usually erring on the side of profit. The result is cookware that retains a ghost of every meal it has ever cooked, a culinary palimpsest of flavors and filth. The physical toll of this work is immense. The scullion spends his days bent double, his hands constantly wet. In the winter, the water in the scullery freezes. He has to break the ice to dip his rag. Chilblains, painful, itchy swellings on the skin caused by poor circulation in the cold, turn his fingers into sausages of agony. If a chilblain bursts, it becomes an open sore, swimming in the dirty dishwater. There are no rubber gloves, no bandages that stay dry. He wraps a rag around the worst of it and keeps scrubbing. The mixture of ash, fat, and dirty water enters the wound, causing infections that can turn septic. It is not uncommon for a scullion to die from a simple cut on the finger, a martyr to the dinner service. And yet, he is invisible. The guests in the great hall, laughing and wiping their mouths on fine linen napkins, never see the boy in the dark corner, bleeding into the dishwater. They do not know that the shine on their platter was bought with the skin of his hands. As the night deepens, The pile of dirty dishes seems to grow rather than shrink, a hydra of domestic labor. The scullion's back screams in protest. He pauses for a moment, straightening up to stretch, and a rat skitters over his foot, bold and unafraid. He doesn't even kick at it. He is too tired. He simply watches it vanish into the shadows behind the woodpile. There is a dark humor in the kitchen staff, a grim acceptance of their lot. They might joke that the rat is just the night inspector, checking the quality of the crumbs. But the laughter is hollow. The scullion picks up the next pot, heavy and black. He grabs a fresh handful of sand. The grit feels like crushed glass against his palm. Shkrr, shkrr. The rhythm resumes, a lullaby of abrasion that sings the kitchen to sleep, even if the dirt never truly sleeps. The pot is scrubbed, but it is never clean. It is merely prepared to be dirty again. Leave the scullion to his rhythmic scrubbing and the scuttling rats, and follow the draft of air deeper into the service wing towards a heavy door that remains locked for good reason. This is the larder, the fortress of the household's calories, a room that straddles the unsettling line between a treasury and a mortuary. As the door pushes open, the air temperature drops, not to the crisp, sterile chill of a modern refrigerator, but to a damp, cellar-like cool that raises gooseflesh on the arms. But it is the smell that hits you first, a complex, heavy perfume that tells the story of humanity's desperate war against time. It smells of brine, of acrid wood smoke, of dried herbs, and underneath it all, the faint, sweet, sickly note of organic matter slowly breaking down. In a world without electricity, this room is the only barrier between survival and starvation, and it is here that we confront the living larder. The name is an irony, for everything in here is dead, yet it is teeming with microscopic life, a biological battlefield where salt and smoke fight to hold back the legions of decay. To your left, hanging from iron hooks driven into the ceiling beams, are the carcasses. In the modern world, meat is sanitized, packaged in plastic, and divorced from the animal it once was. Here, the connection is brutal and direct. A brace of pheasants hangs by their necks, their iridescent feathers dulled by dust. A hare, stiff and elongated, dangles beside a side of venison that is slowly turning a dark, bruised purple. There is a culinary philosophy at work here that might churn a modern stomach. The practice of hanging game. Fresh meat is tough, the muscles seized up in rigor mortis. To make it tender, the medieval cook allows it to hang for days, sometimes weeks, until the natural enzymes and, let's be honest, the initial stages of bacterial decomposition begin to break down the connective tissue. It is a controlled rot. A common rule of thumb for a pheasant is to hang it until the tail feathers can be pulled out with no resistance. Or, in more rustic advice, until the bird falls off the hook entirely. The gourmands of the time prize this high, gamey flavor, a taste that borders on the putrid, distinguishable only by a matter of degrees from meat that would kill you. But the true anchor of the larder is the salting trough. Look at the massive wooden chest against the wall, crusted with white crystals like a frozen wave. Inside lie slabs of beef and pork, buried in coarse, grey salt. This is not a seasoning, it is an excavation. The salt draws the moisture out of the cells, creating an environment so arid that bacteria struggle to replicate. But the process transforms the food into something barely unrecognizable as meat. It becomes salt junk, hard as a boot heel, grey and fibrous. Before it can be eaten, This meat must be soaked in fresh water for hours or days to leach out the brine, and even then, it retains a saline bite that demands gallons of ale to wash down. There is a gentle joke often whispered among the servants that the Lord doesn't buy salt to preserve the meat, but to ensure his guests drink more of his expensive wine. Yet, for the winter months, this rock-hard flesh is the only protein available. The sheer quantity of salt required is staggering. A large household might consume hundreds of pounds a year, making salt a strategic resource as valuable as gold. Opposite the salting trough hangs the harvest of the sea, and it is here that the reality of religious observance meets the limits of hygiene. The church calendar dictates that for roughly a third of the year, Fridays, Saturdays, Lent, and various holy days, no meat can be eaten. The solution is fish, but fresh fish is a luxury for those near the coast. For everyone else, there is stockfish. Look at the stiff, plank-like shapes leaning in the corner. This is cod, dried in the freezing winds of the North Sea until it is hard as wood. It has no smell, no moisture, and seemingly no nutritional value. To prepare it, the cook must take it out to the courtyard and beat it with a hammer for an hour to shatter the fibers before soaking it. It is food that fights back. Alongside the stockfish are barrels of herrings, pickled in brine, their eyes clouding over in the murky liquid. If a barrel is not sealed perfectly, the air creeps in and the fish begin to ferment. A blown barrel of herrings is a grenade of stench that can clear a kitchen faster than a fire. Yet in times of famine, even the slightly sour fish are rinsed and served, masked with a sauce of mustard and vinegar. This brings us to one of the most persistent myths of medieval history, one you have likely heard repeated as fact, that medieval people used heavy spices to mask the taste of rotting meat. Let us pause and gently dismantle this. Spices like pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg are imported from the distant East, traveling thousands of miles across dangerous trade routes. They are astronomically expensive, the Lamborghinis of the pantry. A pound of pepper could cost a laborer's yearly wages. It makes zero economic sense for a cook to take a piece of rotten, dangerous beef worth a few pennies and cover it with spices worth a fortune. If you can afford cinnamon, you can afford fresh meat. The wealthy use spices to flaunt their status, and because they genuinely enjoy the complex, heavily spiced medieval palate, which leans towards the sweet and sour. However, there is a grain of truth at the bottom of the myth. While the rich do not eat rot, the poor might. They do not use expensive spices, but they do use cheap, strong garden herbs, garlic, onions, leeks, and horseradish to make palatable meat that is slightly on the turn or overly salty. The masking is real, but it is done with peasant roots, not sultan's treasures. Yet, despite the salt and the smoke, the larder is never truly secure. It is under constant siege. Look closely at the hams hanging in the smoke-darkened alcove. They are coated in a layer of soot and tar from the smoking process, which creates a protective skin. But see that tiny hole near the bone? That is the work of the larder beetle. It burrows in, laying eggs deep inside the curing meat. The larvae hatch and eat their way out, leaving behind tunnels of frass, insect excrement. A cook slicing into a ham might find the center honeycombed with these tunnels. If he is careful, he cuts around them. If he is hurried, or if the light is poor, the extra protein goes into the pot. And then there is the invisible killer. Sausages, puddings, and cured meats are stuffed into intestines and hung to dry. If the conditions are anaerobic, lacking oxygen, and the temperature is wrong, a deadly bacterium known as Clostridium botulinum thrives. The word botulism actually comes from the Latin botulus, meaning sausage. It is a silent assassin, odorless and tasteless, that strikes days after the meal, paralyzing the muscles and stopping the breath. In this cool, quiet room, death doesn't always smell like rot. Sometimes it hides in the perfectly preserved pink flesh of a summer sausage. As we stand here, shivering slightly in the damp air, the larder feels less like a pantry and more like a laboratory of decomposition. The walls are porous stone, absorbing the odors of a century of slaughtered animals. The floor is scattered with fresh herbs, meadowsweet and wormwood, strewn in a futile attempt to ward off fleas and sweeten the air. But the underlying scent of blood and brine is indelible. Every item in this room is a ticking clock. The venison is softening, the herrings are clouding, the bacon is turning rancid. The cook's job is to race against these clocks, to use the ingredients before they cross the invisible line from nourishment to poison. It is a high-stakes game of inventory management played without thermometers or expiration dates, guided only by the nose, the tongue, and a good deal of prayer. We turn to leave, the heavy door closing with a dull thud, sealing the silence back inside. But as we step back towards the warmth of the kitchen, we carry with us the realization that in the medieval world, food was not a guarantee of health, but a calculated risk, suspended precariously between the salt and the grave. Listen closely now. Past the crackle of the dying fire and the heavy breathing of the sleeping scullion, do you hear it? It starts as a faint scratching behind the wainscoting, a delicate rhythmic gnawing that vibrates through the wooden beams. Then comes the patter of tiny claws on stone, a sound like dry rain falling on the floor. The humans have retired, and the kitchen has changed hands. The rightful owners have arrived. These are the uninvited guests, the shadow tenants who pay no rent but eat the best of the larder, the rodents. To understand the medieval kitchen, one must accept that it was never a solitary space for humans. It was a shared ecosystem. We are not talking about the large, lumbering brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, that dominates modern city sewers. That species is a latecomer, an invader from the east that will not arrive in force until the 18th century. No, the medieval kitchen belongs to the black rat, Rattus rattus, also known as the ship rat or the roof rat. This distinction is crucial. The black rat is smaller, sleeker, and a terrifyingly agile climber. It does not scuttle along the floorboards. It runs across the rafters, balances on the rim of the cauldron, and nests in the thatched roof directly above the food. It is an acrobat of the dark, capable of dropping from the ceiling onto the table with unnerving precision. Imagine standing in the center of the room as the night watch begins. You see a pair of eyes flash in the ember light, glowing with a keen, intelligent hunger. Then another pair, then a dozen. They move with a liquid grace, poring over the sacks of grain and the baskets of apples. The relationship between the medieval cook and the rat is a complex war of attrition. There is no exterminator to call, no poison that is safe to use around food. The primary defense is physical barriers, but the rat is an engineer of destruction. It can chew through wood, lead piping, and even soft mortar. In the flour bin, a vital storage chest for the daily bread, the cook might find a neat, circular hole gnawed through the bottom corner. Inside, the pristine white landscape of the flower is marred by trails of footprints and small dark pellets. This brings us to a stomach-churning reality. The contamination was unavoidable. It was impossible to sift out every impurity. When the flour was scooped out to make the Lord's manchet bread, the baker would sieve it through a bolting cloth, catching the weevils and the larger droppings. But the microscopic residue, the urine, the hair, the pulverized filth, passed through into the dough. It was baked into the crust. Historians and archaeologists, analyzing medieval coprolites, fossilized feces, have found evidence of this accidental intake. To eat medieval bread was, in a very literal sense, to eat the environment of the kitchen, rodents included. But the rats were not merely thieves. They were vectors of a horror that the kitchen staff felt but could not name. We know now that the fleas carried by these black rats harbored Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the Black Death. When the rats died, the fleas jumped to the nearest warm body, often the scullion sleeping by the fire. Yet, in the years between the Great Plagues, the danger was more insidious. Rats constantly dribble urine as they move, marking their territory with invisible trails that communicate with other rats. This urine carries leptospirosis, a bacterial disease that causes fever, liver failure, and jaundice. A cook might wipe a cutting board with a rag that has fallen on the floor, effectively smearing these invisible trails across the surface where the vegetables are chopped. The sweating sickness, or the sudden fevers that took so many lives, were often born here, in the quiet communion between the rat and the preparation table. To combat this tide of fur and teeth, the kitchen deployed its own biological weapon, the cat. But erase the image of the pampered, purring house pet curling up on a lap. The medieval kitchen cat was a working animal, a piece of equipment with a pulse. They were often kept half-starved to ensure their hunting instinct remained sharp. A well-fed cat is a lazy mouser, or so the logic went. These cats were fierce, scarred warriors, missing ears and nursing abscesses from their nightly battles. They patrolled the pantry and the scullery, keeping the numbers down, but never truly eliminating the threat. And here lies another layer of irony. The cat, the guardian of the grain, was itself a walking biological hazard. It walked through the midden heap outside, stepped in the rat runs, and then jumped onto the preparation counters. In the medieval mind, the cat was clean because it groomed itself. But we now know that Toxoplasma gondii, a parasite found in cat feces, can be transferred to humans, causing flu-like symptoms and behavioral changes. The cat would catch a rat, play with it on the kitchen floor amidst the rushes, and leave the carcass under the table for the scullion to find in the morning. It was a crude, brutal form of pest control that simply traded one set of germs for another. There were other, more superstitious attempts to control the invasion. People believed that rats could be rhymed to death or persuaded to leave by a strongly worded letter. It was not uncommon for a desperate householder to write a note to the king of the rats, politely requesting that the colony move to a neighbor's house, perhaps the blacksmith down the road, who had more grain. These notes would be greased with fat and stuffed into the rat holes. When the rats ate the paper because of the grease, the human interpreted it as acceptance of the deal. If the rats didn't leave, it was assumed the wording was insufficiently persuasive. It captures the helplessness of the era. Faced with an enemy they could not defeat, they tried to negotiate. In the grander castles, The rat catcher was a paid professional, a man who smelled of ferrets and arsenic, who would set traps and snares. He was paid by the tail. This created a perverse incentive where some rat catchers would breed rats in secret to ensure a steady supply of tails to sell to the Lord. An early example of the cobra effect, where the solution actually increases the problem. And let us not forget the smaller cousins, the mice. While the rats ruled the rafters, the mice claimed the nooks and crannies. They nested in the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, turning a bundle of sage into a cozy, fragrant nursery. When the cook reached up to pull down a handful of herbs for the soup, he might disturb a nest, sending a rain of pink, blind babies and dust into the pot below. Protein, the kitchen staff might joke darkly, fishing them out with a ladle. But the grim reality was that the boundary between the food and the vermin was non-existent. The food chain in a medieval kitchen was a circle. The humans fed the rats with their waste and storage. The rats fed the cats. And the waste of the rats and cats often found its way back into the humans. It was a closed loop of consumption. As you lie there, imagine the sound of the kitchen at 3 a.m. It is not silent. It is a busy, bustling city of small noises. The gnawing of a wooden spoon handle, the squeak of a territorial dispute over a piece of dropped cheese, the thump of a cat landing on the rushes. The kitchen is breathing. It is alive with a nocturnal energy that rivals the daytime activity. The humans are merely the day shift. The rodents are the night shift, and they are far more numerous. They run their paws over the spoons you will use at breakfast. They sniff the rim of your goblet. They are the true masters of the domain, ancient and resilient. The cook may hold the ladle, but the rat holds the territory. And as the first grey light of dawn begins to bleed through the shutters, the uninvited guests retreat to their shadows, leaving behind their invisible signatures on every surface, waiting for the sun to set so they can reclaim their kingdom once more. But as the rats fade into the walls, other eyes are watching, thousands of them, multifaceted and unblinking, waiting for the warmth of the day to wake them up. As the sun climbs higher and the rats retreat into the cool darkness of the walls, a new sound begins to fill the kitchen, a low, droning hum that rises in volume with the temperature. The shift change is complete. The night shift has retired, and the day shift has awoken. We are entering the domain of the insect, a kingdom where the boundaries between food and fauna dissolve entirely. In the modern world, a single housefly buzzing against a window pane is an annoyance, a creature to be swatted or sprayed. In the medieval kitchen, the flies are not an annoyance. They are a weather system. They are a physical element of the room, as ubiquitous as the smoke or the draft. Imagine a leg of mutton sitting on the preparation table, glistening with fat. It does not stay red for long. Within minutes, it is clothed in a shimmering, iridescent blanket of green bottles and blue bottles, a moving mosaic of wings and compound eyes. The cook does not wave them away constantly. It would be a futile exercise, like trying to wave away the tide. He simply works through them, his knife slicing through the cloud, occasionally severing a fly in midair that was too slow to move. The real horror, however, is not the adult fly, but its progeny. In the heat of high summer, the life cycle of the blowfly is terrifyingly fast. Eggs laid in the crevices of the meat can hatch into larvae, maggots, within 12 to 24 hours. This brings us to a stomach-turning reality of medieval culinary prep: the polishing of the meat. Before a joint could be roasted, it often had to be scraped. The cook would take a knife and run it over the surface, sloughing off the clusters of white eggs and the wriggling larvae that had appeared overnight. It was a routine chore, no different from peeling a carrot. If the maggots had burrowed deep, the meat was not discarded. The affected section was simply cut out. In times of famine or in the poorer households, even that might be considered wasteful. The meat would be cooked thoroughly, the fire serving as the great purifier, turning the larvae into undetectable specks of protein. There is a dark, recurring joke among historians that the medieval diet was far higher in protein than the records suggest, simply due to this accidental insect supplementation. But the insect invasion was not limited to fresh meat. It conquered the dry goods as well. Let us look into the flour bin again, or perhaps the barrel of ship's biscuits or hardtack, kept for long voyages or winter sieges. These were often infested with weevils, small beetles with long snouts that bore into the hard crust to lay their eggs. The biscuit weevil, Stagobium panaceum, is a creature of immense patience. It can live for generations inside a sealed barrel, turning the hard bread into a honeycomb of dust. Sailors and soldiers developed a specific etiquette for eating this infested food. They would tap the biscuit hard against the table before taking a bite, knocking the adult weevils out. The larvae, however, remained inside, soft and creamy, tasting faintly of bitter almonds. It was said that you should eat the biscuit in the dark so you couldn't see what you were consuming, a philosophy that applied to much of medieval life. What is fascinating is the medieval understanding, or lack thereof, of where these creatures came from. This was the era of the theory of spontaneous generation. Scholarly minds, following the ancient texts of Aristotle, genuinely believed that life could arise from non-living matter. They believed that rotting meat created maggots, that dust created fleas, and that river mud created eels. In their eyes, the insects were not invaders entering the kitchen from outside. They were a natural product of the kitchen itself, a transformation of the food. This belief made hygiene a philosophical confusion. If the meat itself was generating the worms, covering it wouldn't help. It was a battle against the nature of matter. And then there were the wasps. In late summer, when the fruit was being preserved and the sugar or honey was out, the kitchen became a war zone of yellow jackets. They were aggressive, drawn to the sweetness and the blood of the butchery. A cook cutting fruit would often be stung, his hands swelling as he worked. Without ice or antihistamines, he would apply a poultice of mud or perhaps a slice of raw onion to the sting and carry on. The insects were inescapable. They were in the wine, floating on the surface of the hypocras. They were in the pottage. They were crawling in the hair of the scullery maids. To live in a medieval kitchen was to accept that you were never eating alone. You were sharing every meal with 1,000 tiny, uninvited guests who claimed the food as their birthright. The buzzing is a constant white noise, a soundtrack to the chopping and the stirring. A reminder that in this world, humans are just another organism competing for the calorie. But as we wipe the imaginary flies from our faces, our attention is drawn to the tools the cook is using, the heavy, blackened objects that endure the fire and the filth alike. Your gaze settles now on the heavy iron hook descending from the soot-stained rafters, holding the single most important object in the medieval home, the cauldron. If the fire is the heart of the kitchen, the cauldron is its stomach. It is a massive, round-bellied vessel, cast from bronze or iron, heavy enough to crush a man, and valuable enough to be listed first in a last will and testament. In the flickering light, its surface looks like the skin of an old elephant, pitted, scarred, and blackened by years of exposure to wood smoke. This is not the smooth, non-stick cookware of the modern age. It is a geological artifact of culinary history. Run your hand along the rim in your mind. It is rough, perhaps chipped and greasy to the touch. This pot is rarely cold. It hangs permanently over the fire, lowered down into the flames by a trammel hook or a ratchet mechanism when the heat is needed, and raised up to a simmer when the meal is done. It is here that we encounter the most famous and perhaps most misunderstood concept of medieval cooking, the perpetual stew. There is a romantic notion that in peasant cottages, a single pot of stew was kept boiling for centuries, with new ingredients simply tossed in to replace what was eaten, meaning a man might eat a piece of beef that his grandfather put in the pot. This is an exaggeration, but the truth is close enough to be unsettling. The pottage, a thick porridge-like soup of peas, beans, onions, and whatever meat could be scavenged, was indeed the staple diet. Fuel was expensive and labor was hard, so it made no sense to let the fire go out or to empty the pot completely every night. The pot was a battery of calories. In the winter, it likely did stay on the hearth for weeks at a time. Each day the cook would add water, a handful of oats, a turnip, or a trapped rabbit. The flavors would meld into a uniform gray-brown sludge, the texture of heavy mud. The heat of the simmer was usually sufficient to keep the bacterial count manageable, but the edges of the pot, where the soup cooled and crusted against the metal, were a different story. Here in the lukewarm rim, the spores of Clostridium perfringens, the bacteria responsible for the stomach flu that plagues so many, could survive, waiting to be stirred back into the main mix with the morning ladle. But the danger of the cauldron was not just biological, it was chemical. We must talk about the metal itself. Iron pots were heavy and durable, but they rusted. To prevent rust, they were kept greasy. But many finer pots were made of copper or bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Copper is an excellent conductor of heat, but it is chemically reactive. Medieval cooks loved to use vinegar, verjuice, sour grape juice, and wine in their sauces to cut the fattiness of the meat. These acids, when simmering for hours in a copper pot, would slowly dissolve the metal, creating copper salts. If a copper pot was left to sit with food in it overnight, a ring of green crystals would form at the waterline. This is verdigris, copper acetate. It is a poison. Yet, in a terrifying twist of historical irony, some medieval cookbooks actually recommended adding a penny to the boiling vegetables to induce this reaction, because the verdigris turned the vegetables a vibrant, bright green. They were dyeing their food with poison to make it look fresher. The stomach cramps and vomiting that followed were often blamed on surfeit or eating too much, rather than the slow accumulation of heavy metals in the liver. Turn your head slightly to the right of the cauldron, where the heat is most intense. Here the great joints of meat, the prerogative of the wealthy, are roasting. The spit is a long iron rod thrust through a whole pig, a side of beef, or a dozen chickens. It rests on distinct iron brackets called andirons. But a spit does not turn itself. In the early Middle Ages, this was the job of the lowliest human in the household, the turn-spit boy. Imagine a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sitting on a low stool next to a roaring fire that is hot enough to blister skin. His job is to slowly, rhythmically crank the handle of the spit, hour after hour. He cannot stop, or the meat will burn on one side and stay raw on the other. He is half-cooked himself, his face red and peeling, his eyes damagingly dry from the smoke and heat. He shields his face with a wet piece of wood or a bundle of straw, but the thermal assault is relentless. It is a form of torture disguised as employment. As time moved on and mechanical ingenuity grew, the boy was sometimes replaced by a tragic biological invention, the turnspit dog. This was a specific breed of dog, long-bodied and short-legged, similar to a modern corgi or dachshund, bred specifically to run inside a wooden wheel mounted on the wall. The wheel was connected to the spit by a system of pulleys. As the dog ran, the spit turned. These dogs, known in Latin as verne pater cur, were the engines of the kitchen. They were often treated with the same indifference as a pair of bellows. If the dog slowed down due to exhaustion, the cook might throw a hot coal into the wheel to force it to run faster. When the roast was done, the dog was lifted out, given a drink of water, and ignored until the next feast. It is a stark reminder that in the medieval pursuit of a hot meal, empathy was often the first ingredient to be discarded. Beneath the turning spit sits another essential tool, the dripping pan, or le chaufrite. This is a long, shallow tray placed to catch the rendering fat and juices falling from the roasting meat. This dripping was liquid gold. It was used to boss the meat, to fry onions, or to make sauces. In later centuries, batters would be poured into this pan to cook in the hot fat, evolving into what we know today as Yorkshire pudding. But consider the journey of that fat. It drips from the meat, which may have been fly-blown. It falls through the air, catching the ash and soot drifting from the fire. It lands in a pan that sits on the floor of the hearth, a zone accessible to the wandering cats, the rats, and the hem of the scullion's dirty tunic. The pan is rarely washed with soap. It is merely wiped out with bread, which is then eaten as a treat. The accumulation of carbonized fat on the edges of the dripping pan created a harbor for carcinogenic compounds, though the medieval diner knew nothing of cancer. They only knew the savory, smoky taste of the sop, the bread soaked in the blackened grease. There is a final hidden danger in the cookware: the glaze. In the later Middle Ages, earthenware pots became popular for storage and slow cooking. To make them waterproof, potters used a lead-based glaze. It was cheap, it was shiny, and it fired at a low temperature. When these pots were used to store acidic things, pickled onions, wine, or vinegar, the lead leached out into the liquid. It was a slow poison, sweet to the taste. Lead acetate is known as sugar of lead. It caused colic, paralysis, and madness. The gout that plagued so many wealthy gluttons was often exacerbated by the lead in their wine jugs and cooking pots, damaging their kidneys and preventing the excretion of uric acid. The kitchen, therefore, was a chemistry lab where the experiments were uncontrolled and the results were often fatal. The noise of the spit mechanism, the squeak of the iron, the panting of the dog, the hiss of fat hitting the hot metal, blends with the bubbling of the cauldron. The cook strikes the rim of the pot with a ladle, a bell tolling for dinner. He scoops out the pottage, thick and glutinous. He slices the meat, pink near the bone. The food is plated, ready to be carried up to the high table. But as the servants lift the trays, Drops of gravy and globs of pottage spill over the sides. They do not land on a tiled, sanitized surface. They land on the floor, and it is there, beneath the feet of the busy staff, that the true geological history of the kitchen is written. We must lower our eyes now, down from the fire and the pots, to the ground itself. For in the medieval kitchen, you are not just walking on a floor, you are walking on a compost heap that has been decomposing for decades. Lower your gaze now, away from the bubbling pots and the sweating cook, and look down at your feet. In a modern kitchen, the floor is a surface of hard, impermeable ceramic or vinyl, designed to be sanitized with a single swipe of a mop. Here, the floor is not a surface. It is a geology. It is a living, breathing entity that holds the history of the household in its layers. In the humblest peasant cottages, you are standing on packed earth, hard and cold, which turns to mud when the roof leaks. But in the manor houses and castles, the stone flags are covered in rushes, dried reeds, straw, or sweet-smelling herbs scattered across the ground to provide insulation and catch the debris. It sounds quaint, almost pastoral, like walking through a meadow. But this meadow is rotting. The practice of strewing herbs is one of the most romanticized aspects of medieval life. We read of floors covered in meadow sweet, lavender, and basil, releasing a pleasant fragrance when crushed underfoot. And this was true for the first few hours, but the herbs were not there merely for aesthetics. They were an olfactory mask, a desperate attempt to cover the stench of what lay beneath. Imagine the life cycle of this floor covering. In a busy kitchen, the rushes act as a giant absorbent sponge. When the scullion spills a ladle of gravy, it doesn't puddle on the stone, it soaks into the straw. When the cook cracks an egg and misses the bowl, the white glides into the reeds. When the turnspit dog relieves itself because no one let it out, the liquid disappears into the mat. Over days and weeks, these layers of organic matter, grease, beer, blood, spit, and urine accumulate at the bottom, creating a damp, fermenting compost layer known as the marsh. It is a dark, humid microclimate perfect for the incubation of molds and fungi. The top layer might look fresh and green, scattered with new straw to welcome a guest, but it is merely a cosmetic lid on a septic tank. There is a famous account from the scholar Erasmus, writing in the early 16th century, looking back at the habits that defined the medieval era, where he describes the floors of English houses with horrified fascination. He notes that the bottom layer of rushes is often left undisturbed for 20 years, harboring sputum, vomit, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not to be mentioned. While Erasmus was likely exaggerating the 20 years for dramatic effect, historians argue that a well-run castle would do a full mucking out a few times a year. The essence of his complaint was vividly real. The kitchen floor was a place where waste went to hide, not to die. Consider the bones. In the preparation of meat, cartilage, gristle, and small bones are hacked away. While the larger bones are thrown to the dogs, the smaller fragments often fall into the rushes. There they are gnawed on by the mice we met earlier, or they simply settle into the mulch, becoming sharp little caltrops waiting for a barefoot or a thin leather shoe. If you were to excavate a medieval kitchen floor today, you would find a distinct stratum of pulverized bone, a fossil record of dinners past. This floor was also the repository for human biological byproducts. Spitting was common and socially acceptable, provided you did it discreetly. If a cook felt the need to clear his throat of the soot and smoke he was inhaling, he spat on the floor and scuffed a fresh rush over it. If a scullion cut his finger, the blood dripped onto the rushes. It was a culture that believed the earth would absorb everything, a philosophy that works in a forest but fails catastrophically in a closed room. The presence of the dogs adds another layer of complexity to this ecosystem. In a modern home, we might panic if a dog walks through a food preparation area. In the medieval kitchen, the dogs were the vacuum cleaners. They roamed freely, snatching up dropped crusts and licking the grease spots from the stones where the rushes had worn thin. On one hand, they reduced the amount of rotting food. On the other, they introduced their own parasites, fleas and dirt from the stable yard directly into the cooking zone. A dog might snap at a flea, swallowing a tapeworm larva, then lick the hand of the cook, who then kneads the dough. The cycle of transmission was seamless. The fleas themselves found the rush-covered floor to be a paradise. It offered warmth, humidity, and a steady supply of hosts passing by. Walking across a medieval kitchen floor often meant acquiring a colony of hitchhikers around your ankles. This is why women tucked their skirts up and men wore tight hose. It was a defensive dress code against the floor population. There is a grim practicality to the mucking out process when it finally happened. It was a job for the lowest of the low. The rake or shovel would be brought in to scrape up the sodden, heavy mat of decaying straw. The smell released during this operation would have been indescribable, a sudden release of methane and ammonia that had been trapped under the weight of the traffic. This waste, rich in nitrogen and filth, was then carted out to the midden heap or the garden, a direct transfer of kitchen bacteria to the vegetable patch, completing the circle of infection. But in the winter, when opening the doors to shovel out the floor would mean letting in the freezing cold, the changing of the rushes was often delayed. Fresh straw was simply piled on top of the old. The floor level would physically rise over the months. In some archaeological surveys of peasant dwellings, the threshold stones at the door are worn down not just by feet, but by the friction of the rising floor abutting against the wood. They were literally living on top of their own history. Yet, amidst this squalor, there was a strange, misguided attempt at hygiene. The use of strewing herbs was driven by the theory of miasma, the belief that disease was caused by bad smells, bad air. The logic was, if it smells like lavender, it is clean. If it smells like rot, it is dangerous. So, by scattering fragrant meadowsweet, chamomile, and mint, they believed they were sanitizing the room. They were fighting the scent of the bacteria, not the bacteria itself. It was the medieval equivalent of spraying air freshener over a pile of garbage. They did not understand that the sweet smell of the wilting herbs was providing the perfect sugar source for the very microbes they were trying to suppress. The floor was a deception, a beautiful, fragrant trap. It is here, standing on this sponge of history, that the sensory experience of the kitchen becomes overwhelming. The heat from the fire presses against your face, the smoke stings your eyes, and the floor beneath you feels soft, yielding, and damp. You are standing in a biohazard zone that would terrify a modern health inspector. Yet to the people working here, this is simply the ground. It is where they stand for 12, 14 hours a day. It is where they sometimes sleep, curling up in the corner on the warmest patch of rushes, pressing their faces against the straw that hides the spittle of their co-workers. It is a testament to the resilience of the human immune system that anyone survived this environment at all. But survive they did, building antibodies the hard way, one exposure at a time. The floor is the foundation of the kitchen, but it is also a reservoir of the invisible enemy that dictates the fate of kings and peasants alike. As we lift our feet from the clinging rushes, shaking off a stray beetle, we must turn our attention to the things we cannot see. The microscopic army that thrives in this warmth, waiting to be carried from the floor to the hand, to the mouth. Lift your eyes from the compost of the floor and focus now on the most dangerous tool in the kitchen. It is not the sharp iron knife, nor the heavy bronze cauldron, nor the roaring fire that can catch a hem and turn a cook into a torch. It is the human hand. In the flickering light of the hearth, watch the hands of the master cook as he works. They are broad, scarred, and strong, capable of disjointing a swan or kneading a bushel of dough. But they are also the primary transport system for the invisible enemy that rules this room. We are entering the era before the microscope, before Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch shattered the illusion of purity. To the medieval mind, the world is governed by the macro, by stars, by humors, by visible dirt. The micro, the bacteria, the viruses, the parasites, is a realm of total darkness. Yet, as we watch the cook, we can see the chain of infection glowing like a phosphorescent trail in the gloom, a sequence of events so routine and yet so deadly that it chills the modern observer to the bone. The cook has just finished gutting a hare. His hands are slick with blood and the fluids of the animal's entrails. In a modern kitchen, he would turn to a sink, pump antibacterial soap, and scrub for 20 seconds under hot water. Here, he reaches for the clout. This is a cloth, usually a piece of coarse linen or hemp, that hangs from his belt or is tucked into his apron string. It is the universal applicator of the kitchen. He wipes his hands on it, transferring the visible blood to the fabric. The hands now look cleaner, but the bacteria, Salmonella, Francisella tularensis, have simply been spread into a thin, invisible film across his skin. The clout itself is a biological weapon. It is damp, warm from the heat of the fire, and encrusted with the proteins of 100 previous wipes. It is rarely washed, merely rinsed in the grey water we saw earlier, or dried by the fire where the heat incubates the colonies within the fibers. There is a grim joke among historical reenactors that the medieval kitchen towel wasn't washed until it was stiff enough to stand up on its own and ask for a drink. This rag wipes the sweat from the cook's brow, the knife blade, the rim of the bowl, and the nose of the scullion. It is the great unifier, mixing the sweat of the man with the juice of the meat. Now, watch the hands move. The cook turns from the hare to the pastry table. He takes a handful of flour and begins to knead the dough for a coffin, a hard pastry crust used to encase meats. The bacteria from the hare are now being massaged deep into the gluten structure of the bread. He works with a rhythm born of years of practice, pushing, folding, turning. If he has a cut on his finger, and he almost certainly does, from a slip of the knife or a cracked chilblain, the Staphylococcus aureus living on his skin is joining the mix. He pauses to scratch a flea bite on his ankle, his fingers brushing the rush-covered floor we just left, picking up a microscopic souvenir of the rat droppings. Then back to the dough. It is a seamless dance of cross-contamination. The concept of raw versus cooked separation exists only in terms of the final product, not the preparation space. The same wooden board is used for the chicken, the onions, and the bread, wiped down only with the deadly clout in between. There is a moment of ritual hygiene that might deceive you. In wealthy households, before the meal, the lord and his guests wash their hands. Servants bring an aqua manile, a beautiful brass vessel often shaped like a lion or a knight on horseback, and pour water over their hands into a basin. It looks elegant. It looks sanitary, but the water is cold. There is no soap, only perhaps a few fragrant herbs floating in the bowl. And the towel they use to dry their hands has been handled by the same servants who just mucked out the stables. It is ceremonial cleanliness, designed to remove visible dirt and demonstrate status, not to kill pathogens. The cook in the kitchen does not even get the aqua manile. He gets the bucket. And since fat is hydrophobic, it repels water. Rinsing greasy hands in cold water does nothing but spread the lipid layer around, sealing the bacteria against the skin. This brings us to the tasting. Watch the cook as he checks the seasoning of the sauce. He does not use a disposable plastic spoon. He uses his ladle, or perhaps a spoon that hangs by the pot. He dips it in, slurps a mouthful, and, almost instinctively, dips it back into stir. Or, in a more rustic moment, he might simply dip his finger into the sauce and suck it clean. It is a direct line from his mouth, which may be harboring rotting teeth and gum disease, to the communal pot. If he is carrying the early stages of tuberculosis or strep throat, he has just seasoned the soup with it. Historians still debate the extent of folk wisdom regarding sickness. Did they notice that when the cook had a flux, the household got sick? Sometimes. Monastic orders, with their strict rules of silence and cleanliness, often had lower disease rates. But generally, the connection was missed because the delay between ingestion and symptoms could be days. If you ate the contaminated pottage on Tuesday and fell sick on Friday, you blame the Friday fish or the cold draft you sat in, not the cook's finger from 3 days ago. The medical philosophy of the time blinded them to the truth. They believed in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a balance of these fluids. Sickness was an imbalance caused by the alignment of the planets, the miasma, bad air, from a swamp, or a moral failing. If a wave of dysentery swept through the castle, the physician did not look at the kitchen hygiene. He looked at the stars. He might prescribe bloodletting to reduce the heat of the fever, which only weakened the patient further as they fought off the E. coli infection. They were fighting a war against a ghost, while the real enemy was breeding on the cutting board. The miasma theory was particularly tragic because it focused entirely on smell. If the kitchen smelled of roasting meat and herbs, it was considered healthy, even if that meat was teeming with toxins. Conversely, a clean but musty room might be considered dangerous. They were trusting their noses in a world where the deadliest threats were odorless. As the meal is plated, the invisible enemy moves to the final stage, the service. The food is placed on platters, carried through the drafty corridors, where dust and soot drift down from the torches. It is set before the diners. They eat with their hands, knives and spoons, yes, but fingers are the primary forks of the Middle Ages. They rip the bread, dip the meat, wipe the trenchers. The bacteria that began on the hair travel to the clout, move to the cook's hand, and hid in the pastry, now enters the body of the noble. The stomach acts as the final gatekeeper. The medieval gut was likely tougher than ours, a biological fortress hardened by constant exposure. A modern time traveler eating this meal would likely be hospitalized within hours. The medieval diner might just feel a familiar rumble, a wobbling of the stomach that they accept as a normal part of digestion. But often, the load was too high. The bloody flux, dysentery, was a leading killer of kings and commoners alike. It was a death of exhaustion, dehydration, and indignity born in the unseen world of the kitchen. As we stand in the shadows, watching the cook wipe his hands on the clout one last time, we realize the terrifying intimacy of this history. We are not just looking at a room. We are looking at a biological exchange. The kitchen is a place where the fluids of the world, animal, vegetable, and human, mix freely. It is a testament to the tenacity of life that humanity survived its own food preparation. The cook turns to bank the fire, his silhouette dark against the embers, unaware that he is the carrier of a million tiny deaths. He is just doing his job, fighting the visible dirt, while the invisible truth laughs in the darkness. But the heat that incubates these terrors is also the kitchen's greatest enemy in another way, for as the seasons turn, the temperature in this stone box will rise to levels that break the spirit as well as the body. As the wheel of the year turns, the damp chill of spring gives way to the oppressive, crushing weight of high summer, and the medieval kitchen transforms from a place of smoky refuge into a stone-walled furnace. If the winter kitchen was a cave, the summer kitchen is a kiln. The sun beats down on the slate or thatched roof, heating the attic spaces above, while inside the great hearth, the heart that cannot stop beating, continues to roar. There is a cruel irony in medieval cooking. To eat, one must have fire, regardless of the weather. A lord does not crave a cold salad simply because it is August. He desires roasted swan, baked lampreys, and hot pies. And so, on days when the outside air is already thick enough to chew, the kitchen staff must feed logs into the maw of the fireplace, raising the internal temperature to levels that would simulate a fever in the human body. Stand in the center of the room now and feel the difference. The air is no longer gray and moving. It is still, heavy, and shimmering with a heat that blurs the vision. The stone walls, which held the cold in winter, now act as a thermal battery, absorbing the heat of the fire by day and radiating it back at night, ensuring that the room never truly cools. It is a suffocating embrace, a heat that carries weight. It presses against your chest and slicks your skin with an instant, sticky sheen. In this swelter, the sensory experience of the kitchen shifts from the visual to the olfactory. Heat amplifies smell, the odors we encountered earlier, the unwashed bodies, the decaying rushes on the floor, the rendering fat, the open latrines in the courtyard, are now cooked by the ambient temperature, blending into a miasma so thick it feels solid. The concept of fresh air is a distant memory. Windows are small, designed to keep heat in during the winter and to secure the castle against arrows, not to provide cross-ventilation. The smoke from the hearth, sluggish in the heavy air, hangs low, mingling with the steam from the boiling pots to create a humid, tropical microclimate where sweat does not evaporate. It simply drips. Watch the cook. He has stripped down to his linen undershirt, which is soaked through and clinging to his back like a second skin. He wears a linen cap to catch the sweat from his forehead, but it is a losing battle. Drops of saline moisture fall onto the cutting board, into the dough, and onto the roasting meat. It is an involuntary seasoning, a testament to the physical exertion required to turn a spit or lift a cauldron in 100-degree heat. This is the season of the dog days, named for the rising of the dog star, Sirius, a time associated by the ancients with fever, madness, and bad luck. In the kitchen, this madness is literal. The heat shortens tempers. Knife fights and brawls are statistically more common in the summer records of court disputes. The humors of the body, specifically the blood and the yellow bile, are thought to be overheated, leading to choleric outbursts. A scullion moving too slowly might earn a ladle to the head, not just for his laziness, but because the cook is on the verge of heatstroke. But the true victim of the summer swelter is the food itself. We are standing in a giant incubator. The temperature in this room hovers constantly in what modern food safety experts call the danger zone, between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, where bacteria reproduce at exponential rates. A side of beef that might last a week in winter will turn green in 2 days here. The cook is locked in a frantic race against the clock of decay. He must cook the meat almost as soon as it is slaughtered, or else preserve it immediately. This leads to the heavy use of vinegar and verjuice marinades, not merely for the tart flavor that medieval palates adored, but because the acid creates a hostile environment for surface bacteria. It is a chemical preservation method born of necessity. Milk is another casualty. Without refrigeration, fresh milk is a transient substance, turning to sour clabber within hours. This is why medieval people consumed so little fresh milk and so much cheese and butter. Transforming the milk was the only way to save it. The dairymaid is often depicted in pastoral art as a cool, serene figure in a meadow. But in reality, she was often frantically churning butter in the coolest corner of the pantry before the cream turned rancid. Myth suggests that medieval castles had deep ice houses filled with winter snow to keep things cool. While these existed for the very highest nobility, kings and great dukes who could afford the immense labor of cutting and storing ice in straw-lined pits, for the vast majority of households, including minor gentry, cooling was a relative term. It meant lowering a bucket of butter down the well to hang just above the water line. It meant wrapping a jug of wine in a wet cloth and standing it in a draught, praying that evaporation would drop the temperature by a few degrees. It was a passive, often futile struggle against the sun. The summer also brought a specific biological horror to the flour and grain: the hatching. The weevils and mealworms we saw earlier thrive in warmth. In the heat of August, the flour bin would seemingly come alive, the surface undulating gently as thousands of larvae woke up. The sifting became more urgent, the waste higher. Bread baked in summer often had a denser, grittier texture, partially from the hasty preparation and partially from the extra biological chaff that couldn't be removed. And let us not forget the water. The river, low and slow-moving in the summer drought, became a concentrated soup of the city's effluent. Algae bloomed, turning the water green and foul-smelling. To drink water in August was to invite the summer flux, a violent dysentery that could dehydrate a man to death in a day. This is why the consumption of small beer, weak, low-alcohol ale, skyrocketed in the summer. It was the only hydration that was safe, yet drinking alcohol in a sweltering kitchen only added to the dehydration and the drowsiness of the staff. The afternoons in a medieval summer kitchen were a haze of heat-induced stupor. The staff moved in slow motion, conserving energy. The scullion might be found asleep under the table, mouth open, flies walking on his lip. The cook might be dozing in a chair by the door, the ladle slipping from his hand. It was a time of suspended animation, waiting for the sun to set. But even nightfall brought little relief. The stones, having absorbed the sun all day, radiated heat well past midnight. The kitchen remained a warm oven. Many servants would choose to sleep outside in the courtyard or on the roof, risking the night air and its supposed miasmas, rather than endure the stifling embrace of the kitchen. As you wipe the imaginary sweat from your own brow, feeling the phantom heat of that ancient fire, you realize that the summer kitchen was a test of endurance. It was a place where the very air fought against you, where the food tried to rot before it could be eaten, and where the simple act of staying alive required a constant replenishment of fluids that were themselves suspect. It was a season of abundance, of fresh fruits and vegetables, but an abundance that carried the seeds of its own rapid destruction. The heat feels eternal, a heavy blanket that will never lift. But the wheel of time is relentless. Just as the heat reaches its zenith, the days begin to shorten. The light changes, the wind shifts, and the kitchen, which has been an oven, prepares to become something else entirely. The enemy changes from the heat that rots to the cold that preserves and kills. The heat of August, which seemed so interminable, eventually breaks. The leaves turn the color of rusted iron and fall into the mud, and the heavy gray skies of November descend like a lead shutter. The kitchen, once a sweltering oven, undergoes a violent transformation. We have entered the season of the winter's chill, and the stone walls that so effectively trapped the heat now turn traitor, sucking the warmth out of the air and radiating a damp, penetrating cold that settles deep in the marrow. To understand the medieval winter kitchen, you must understand the concept of the microclimate. There is no central heating here, no ambient warmth that fills the room from corner to corner. There is only the fire and the void. Stand close to the hearth, and your front is scorched, your skin flushing red, your clothes steaming. Take 3 steps back towards the unglazed window or the drafty door, and your breath plumes in white clouds before your face. The medieval cook lives in a state of thermal schizophrenia, perpetually roasting on one side and freezing on the other. It is a common complaint in the literature of the time. The sensation of having a roasted face and a frozen spine. The first casualty of the cold is the water. The bucket that the carrier hauled from the river does not sit idly in the corner anymore. It freezes. A thick skin of ice forms over the top, requiring the cook to keep a heavy iron ladle or a small hammer nearby just to break the surface, to get a drink or fill a pot. In the scullery, the situation is even grimmer. The soaking tubs turn into blocks of solid ice overnight. The scullion, whose hands are already raw from the lye and the scrubbing, must now plunge them into water that is painfully close to freezing. This is the season of the burnio, the chilblain. These are painful, itchy red swellings on the fingers and toes caused by the restriction of blood vessels in the cold. It is a constant, nagging agony. Almost everyone in the kitchen suffers from them. You might see a kitchen maid pausing to rub her swollen red hands with a mixture of honey and ashes, a common folk remedy, or perhaps holding them dangerously close to the fire, which only makes the itching worse as the blood rushes back too quickly. The simple act of washing a dish becomes a test of physical endurance. Consequently, hygiene, which was already minimal, drops to a catastrophic low. No one wants to strip down and wash in a drafty room with ice water. The layers of clothing, wool upon linen upon leather, stay on, sometimes for months at a time. The body becomes a sealed ecosystem, trapping sweat, dead skin, and fleas against the flesh for warmth. The smell of the winter kitchen is different from the summer. It is less the smell of rotting meat, and more the smell of unwashed humanity, wood smoke, and damp wool. The food supply changes drastically. The abundance of fresh vegetables is gone. The salad greens, the peas, and the beans have long been eaten or dried. The kitchen now relies on the root cellar vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and onions, which sit in heaps in the corner, covered in straw to keep them from freezing. They are durable but monotonous. The menu shrinks. But the cold brings one great advantage. It is the natural refrigerator. The frantic race against rot that defined the summer slows down. A side of beef hanging in the larder will now keep for weeks without spoiling. The hanging of game birds can be extended until the meat is incredibly tender. However, this preservation comes with a risk. If the meat freezes solid, it cannot be cooked properly. The outside will char, while the inside remains a block of red ice. The cook must manage the thawing process carefully, bringing the meat into the warm circle of the hearth hours before it is needed, watching it sweat as it returns to a pliable state. This is also the time when the Little Ice Age began to make itself known, a period of cooling that struck Europe in the late Middle Ages. Winters became longer and more brutal. Chronicles speak of wine freezing in the jugs on the high table, requiring it to be chopped out with hatchets. In the kitchen, the draught is the enemy. The wind howls down the chimney, pushing the smoke back into the room, creating the smother we spoke of earlier. But now it is a cold, biting smoke. The shutters rattle against the stone. To keep the heat in, every crack and crevice is stuffed with rags or straw, sealing the room tight. But this sealing also traps the carbon monoxide and the fumes. The winter kitchen is a dark, hazy tunnel. The days are short. Darkness falls by mid-afternoon. So the work is done by the light of tallow candles. These are made from rendered animal fat, tallow, not the clean-burning beeswax used in the church. Tallow candles smell like burning burger grease and produce a thick, black soot. The cook works in a pool of dim, flickering yellow light, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the wall. It is easy to make mistakes in this half-light, to miss a bone, to cut a finger, to add salt instead of sugar. The darkness is a physical weight, pressing down on the spirit. There is a scholarly debate regarding the caloric intake of the medieval peasant versus the noble during these months. Some historians argue that peasants actually entered a state of semi-hibernation, sleeping far more hours to conserve energy and eating less. But the kitchen staff did not have this luxury. The castle or manor was full of guests, bored knights and nobles stuck indoors by the snow, demanding entertainment and food. The feasting season, Christmas 12th night, meant the kitchen had to work at double capacity. The roasting spit never stopped turning. The heat of the fire was the only comfort, and so the kitchen became the social hub of the house. Servants, who had no business being there, would drift in, standing as close to the fire as they dared, ostensibly to deliver a message or fetch a coal, but really just to thaw their frozen hands. The cook would chase them out with a ladle, protecting his workspace. But at night, the floor of the kitchen became a dormitory. The scullions, the turnspit boys, and even the stable hands would pile into the kitchen to sleep on the rushes, huddling together like a litter of puppies for warmth. It was a tangled mass of bodies, snoring and shivering, taking advantage of the residual heat of the great hearthstones. In this way, the winter kitchen was the womb of the household, the only place where the biting death outside could be held at bay. But the cold also drove other things inside. The rats and mice, sensing the drop in temperature, moved their nests from the fields and the barns into the walls of the kitchen. The insect population, seemingly gone, had merely gone dormant, or moved to the warm crevices near the oven. A cockroach might skitter across the floor, seeking the warmth just as the humans did. And the birds, sparrows and starlings, would sometimes flutter down the chimney, confused by the warmth, ending up flapping frantically in the smoke-filled room until they were caught or died. It was a siege. The snow piled up against the door, blocking the light. The well in the courtyard might freeze over completely, requiring fire to be built inside the well shaft to melt the water, a dangerous and terrifying task. Yet, there is a strange, stark beauty to the winter kitchen. Imagine a pot of spiced wine, hippocras, simmering on the trivet, filling the room with the scent of cinnamon, ginger, and long pepper, scents that warm the blood just by smelling them. The firelight reflects off the frost patterns on the iron hinges of the door. The brutality of the cold fosters a grim camaraderie among the staff. They are the keepers of the fire. Outside, the world is dead and frozen. Inside, there is soup, there is heat, and there is life. They tell stories as they work, dark tales of winter ghosts and wolves, their voices low against the howling wind. They share the humables, the edible entrails of the deer, roasted on a stick over the coals, a chef's treat that the lord in the high hall will never taste. It is a time of survival, of huddling together against the dark. But as the winter drags on, the stores begin to dwindle. The salted meat runs low. The onions rot in the cellar. The flour barrel shows the bottom. And the kitchen looks towards the greatest contrast of the age, the disparity between the table of the king and the bowl of the servant. For while the fire warms everyone, the food does not feed everyone equally. Leave the warmth of the fire now and follow the procession of servants as they carry the heavy silver platters out of the kitchen, down the long, draughty corridor, and into the great hall. Here, beneath the high vaulted ceiling and the tapestries that flutter in the draught, we witness the culmination of the kitchen's labor, the feast. But to understand the true filth of the medieval food system, we must look not just at the dirt on the floor, but at the grotesque inequality of the table. We are witnessing a spectacle of consumption that borders on the obscene. The table of the High Lord is groaning under the weight of sotelts or subtleties. Elaborate sugar sculptures designed to look like castles, ships, or mythical beasts. There is a cockatrice, a Frankenstein's monster of a dish, where the upper half of a pig has been sewn onto the lower half of a capon, a castrated rooster, roasted together to create a creature that does not exist in nature. It is a triumph of culinary engineering, but consider the hands that stitched it. The same needle used to mend a torn tunic or lance a boil may have been used to sew the pig to the chicken. The thread is likely greased with tallow. The visual magnificence masks the crude reality of its construction. But the defining feature of the medieval feast is not the food that is eaten. It is the food that is wasted. Look at the trencher. This is the plate of the Middle Ages, but it is not made of ceramic or wood, though wooden trenchers existed. In a noble house, the trencher is a thick, stale slab of bread, cut from a loaf made specifically for this purpose. It serves as an edible placemat. As the Lord eats his venison in heavy peppercorn sauce, the juices drip down onto the bread. As he eats his lampreys, the oil soaks into the crumb. The trencher absorbs the grease, the blood, and the sauce, becoming a sodden, heavy sponge of flavors. Now, here is the crucial detail. The wealthy diner generally does not eat the trencher. It is considered filler beneath his station. When the meal is done, or when the trencher becomes too soggy to hold, it is swept off the table into a voider, a large basket carried by a servant. It is waste. But in the medieval economy, waste is a relative term. This brings us to the almoner, a specific official in the household whose title comes from the word alms. His job is to collect the scraps. Watch him as he moves down the table. He is not carefully wrapping leftovers in foil for a later snack. He is sweeping the half-eaten ribs, the gnawed bones, the crusts of bread covered in saliva, and the soggy, grease-soaked trenchers into a single communal basket or tub. It is a slop bucket. In theory, this collection is an act of Christian charity. The alms are to be distributed to the poor who gather at the castle gates. But let us look at this transaction through the lens of hygiene. The alms dish is a mixture of the saliva of 50 different guests, the bacteria from their unwashed hands, and the cold, congealing fats of the meal. It is a microbiological grenade. The poor, waiting in the mud outside the gate, are not receiving a fresh meal. They are receiving the biological runoff of the aristocracy. Historians still argue whether this practice was primarily about feeding the hungry or saving the soul of the rich man. The church taught that giving alms reduced time in purgatory, so the Lord was essentially buying his salvation with his garbage. The nutritional value of a grease-soaked bread trencher was high, plenty of calories, but the risk of transmitting tuberculosis, influenza, or herpes from the Lord's table to the beggar's mouth was absolute. Contrast this scene of excess with the reality of the peasant's kitchen, miles away in the village. Here, there are no subtleties, no spices from the Orient, no sugar. There is the famine pot. In times of bad harvest, which were frequent, given the little ice age and the lack of pesticides, the peasant diet shifted from humble to hazardous. They practiced a form of desperate foraging known as pannage, sending pigs into the woods to eat acorns, but often humans had to eat the acorns themselves. Acorns are rich in tannins, bitter and constipating, requiring long boiling to make them edible. They ground up bark from trees to bulk out the flour. They ate famine bread, made from beans, vetches, and even clay to fill the stomach. But the most terrifying element of the peasant famine diet was the grain itself. In a damp, cold summer, the rye in the fields would be infected by a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, or ergot. To the untrained eye, the ergotized grain looked like a slightly enlarged black spur on the ear of corn. If the miller did not remove it, and in a famine you throw nothing away, it was ground into the flour. When baked into bread, the ergot alkaloids survived the heat. The result was a horrific poisoning known as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms were hallucinogenic and physical. Victims felt as though their limbs were burning. their blood vessels constricted so violently that their fingers and toes would turn black, necrose, and fall off. Entire villages could be struck by this madness, dancing in the streets, screaming of demons, and slowly losing their limbs, all because the bread they fought so hard to bake was poison. In the castle, the lord ate white wheat bread, largely immune to ergot. In the cottage, the peasant ate dark rye, playing Russian roulette with every loaf. There is a soft, dark humor to be found in the disparity of the course. In the great hall, a meal might consist of 3 or 4 courses, each containing 10 or 12 different dishes. A guest was not expected to eat everything, but to pick and choose. The waste was the point. It demonstrated that the host had so much food, he didn't care if half of it was thrown away. A course in a peasant house was a single bowl of pottage. If a peasant dropped a piece of bread, he kissed it and apologized to God before eating it. If a lord dropped a piece of meat, the dogs beneath the table fought for it. The floor of the great hall was a second dining room for the greyhounds and spaniels, who snapped and snarled around the ankles of the guests. Occasionally, a bone thrown to a dog would miss and hit a servant, or a dog would vomit the rich, spicy food back onto the rushes, adding to the aroma of the feast. The glamour of the medieval banquet, often depicted in movies with clean tables and polite conversation, was in reality a noisy, messy, and chaotic affair where animals and humans ate in close proximity, and the floor was a splash zone for gravy and wine. The concept of the void is the bridge between these two worlds. At the end of the meal, the cry, "Void the tables," would go up. The ushers would strip the cloths, often using the tablecloth itself to sweep the crumbs and debris into the baskets. This was the harvest of the poor. The almoner would take this basket to the gate. Picture the scene, the golden light of the hall spilling out into the dark courtyard, where the wretches waited. The almoner dumps the basket into a trough, or hands out the soggy trenchers. The hierarchy of society is physically reinforced by the food chain. The king eats the bird, the noble eats the wing, the servant eats the leftovers, the dog eats the bone, and the beggar eats the bread the meat sat on. It is a trickle-down gastronomy, where the filth accumulates the further down the ladder you go. Yet, in a strange twist of biology, the peasant diet, when not famine-struck, was often healthier than the noble one. The rich suffered from surfeit, a polite word for gluttony, leading to gout, obesity, and heart disease. They ate almost no vegetables, considering them peasant food that caused wind. They ate heavily salted meats, rich sauces, and drank copious amounts of wine. The peasant, by necessity, ate a diet high in fiber, vegetables, and whole grains, with very little meat. If they survived the starvation years and the ergot, they often kept their teeth longer and had better digestive health than the lord who was dining on swan and sugar. The filth of the kitchen eventually took its toll on the master, as well as the servant. As the almoner closes the heavy gates, shutting out the clamor of the hungry, we return to the silence of the kitchen. The feast is over. The voiders have been emptied, but the work is not done. The scullions must now tackle the mountain of silver and pewter that has come back from the hall, slick with the congealed fat of 1,000 animals. The cycle of cleaning begins again. The contrast between the feast and the famine is not just a social commentary. It is the engine that drives the kitchen. The fear of hunger drives the peasant to work. The fear of losing status drives the lord to waste. And in the middle, The cook stands, exhausted, wiping his hands on the clout, the architect of a meal he will likely never taste, serving a system that values the appearance of abundance over the reality of sustenance. The fire dies down, but it will never go out, for the hunger of the medieval world is a bottomless pit that can never be fully filled. Turn away from the greasy scullery and the humid chaos of the main kitchen now, and follow the drift of white dust through the archway into the bakehouse. The air here changes texture instantly. It is drier, sharper, and filled with a fine suspended powder that catches the light like a galaxy of tiny stars. This is the domain of the baker, a figure who stands apart from the rest of the kitchen staff, both in skill and in the specific danger he courts. If the cook battles rot and the scullion battles grease, the baker battles the very air he breathes. To enter the medieval bakehouse is to step into a fog. The flour, ground between millstones that slowly disintegrate over time, is not the pure, soft powder of the modern supermarket. It is mixed with the microscopic grit of the stone itself, silica dust. As the baker sacks the flour, sieves it through the bolting cloth, and kneads the massive troughs of dough, he kicks up a cloud that never truly settles. He inhales it for 12 hours a day. Deep in his chest, a slow, silent suffocation is taking place. Medieval physicians had no name for silicosis or baker's asthma, but they noted the shortness of breath and the wheezing cough that plagued those who worked with grain. The moisture in the baker's lungs mixes with the flour dust to form a paste, a literal coating of the bronchial tubes. He is slowly drowning on dry land, and he looks the part of a ghost, covered from head to toe in white dust, with pale skin from working indoors away from the sun. The baker is a spectral figure. His eyelashes are white, his hair is white, and the creases of his face are mapped in white lines. He is a man made of the very substance he sells, a living statue of gluten and grit. Domination of the room belongs to the oven. It is a massive, brooding structure of brick or stone, often built into the thickest wall of the castle to reduce the risk of burning the entire fortress down. This is not an oven with a dial and a glass door. It is a cave. To heat it, the baker does not turn a knob. He builds a raging fire inside the baking chamber itself. Faggots of hazel, ash, or oak are stacked inside and set alight, burning fiercely until the stones of the oven absorb the heat and turn white hot. This brings us to a critical moment of hygiene that is often overlooked. Once the oven is hot enough, test it, perhaps, by throwing a handful of flour in to see if it sparks instantly. The fire must be removed. The baker uses a long iron rake to drag the burning wood and coals out onto the floor, filling the room with smoke and ash. Then, he must clean the floor of the oven before the bread goes in. He uses a scuffle or kinnet, a long pole with a rag or a bundle of wet herbs attached to the end. He mops the hot stone floor, hearing the hiss of steam as the wet clout hits the brick. But consider this. The mop is dipping into a bucket of water that quickly becomes a slurry of ash and charcoal. The floor of the oven is never truly clean. It is merely swept of the largest embers. The bottom of every medieval loaf, therefore, bears the signature of the fire, a crust embedded with ash, charcoal dust, and the grit of the oven floor. This ash crust was often cut off for the nobility, but for the poor, it was just another texture to chew. The hierarchy of the bread that comes out of this oven is a rigid mirror of the society that eats it. At the top is the manger or pain de main, bread of the hand, or perhaps bread of the Lord. Small, round loaves made of the finest, whitest flour, sifted multiple times to remove the bran. It is soft, light, and expensive. Below that is the cheat loaf, whole wheat with the coarse bran removed, grayish in color. Then comes the maslin, a heavy mix of rye and wheat, dense and dark. And finally, at the bottom, is the horse bread or torte bread. This is a brick of dark rye, peas, beans, and lentils, sometimes mixed with chaff. It is so hard that it is often used as a trench, the plate we saw earlier, before being given to the dogs or the poor. The baker must manage all these doughs simultaneously, knowing by instinct which spot in the oven suits which loaf. The manchet goes in the back, where the heat is gentle and even. The horse bread goes near the mouth, where the heat fluctuates. The baker is a man under suspicion. In the medieval mind, he is a figure of necessary evil, a man who controls the staff of life, and is therefore constantly tempted to cheat. Because flour is expensive and bread is sold by weight, the temptation to shortchange the customer is immense. This leads to the famous assize of bread and ale, a strict law dating back to the 13th century in England, which regulated the price and weight of bread based on the price of grain. The penalties for selling a light loaf were brutal. A baker caught cheating could be fined, dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around his neck, or locked in the pillory where the angry townspeople could pelt him with filth. It is from this climate of terror that the baker's dozen is born, to avoid even the accidental chance of a loaf being underweight due to an air bubble or drying out the oven. Bakers would throw in a 13th loaf for every 12 purchased by a huckster, retailer, just to be absolutely safe from the lash of the law. It was not generosity, it was fear, but the cheating went deeper than weight. Historians and chemists have found evidence of horrific adulteration in medieval flour. If the harvest was bad and the flour was dark or clumpy, a dishonest baker might mix in additives to whiten it or increase the bulk. Chalk, pipe clay, and powdered bone were used to make the bread look whiter and heavier. Alum, a mineral salt used in dyeing cloth and tanning leather, was added to make the bread appear larger and whiter than it really was. Alum is an astringent. It tightens the tissues. Chronic consumption of alum-laced bread caused severe constipation, stomach cramps, and chronic indigestion. The phrase heavy bread was not just a metaphor. It was a geological reality. The poor man, buying his cheap loaf, was often eating a percentage of the earth itself, grinding his teeth down on hidden stones, and poisoning his gut with whitening agents. The bakehouse is also a place of living things. The leavening agent is not a packet of dried yeast from a foil sachet. It is barm, the frothy, scum-like yeast skimmed from the top of fermenting ale. The baker is intimately tied to the brewer. He sends a boy with a bucket to the brewhouse to fetch the barm. This yeast is alive, unpredictable, and highly perishable. If the barm is sour or dead, the bread will be heavy and flat like a stone. If it is too active, the dough will explode in the oven. The baker is managing a biological culture in a wooden tub that is rarely washed, because the mother culture trapped in the wood helps start the next batch. This wooden trough is a microbial zoo, while Saccharomyces cerevisiae, yeast, is the guest of honor. Lactobacillus and other wild bacteria join the party, giving medieval bread a distinct sour tang that we now spend days trying to replicate with artisanal sourdough starters. Then, it was simply the taste of the equipment. Fire is the baker's constant companion and his greatest threat. Cities lived in fear of the bakehouse. The oven fires had to be kept burning hot for hours, often overnight. In a city built of wood and thatch, a spark from a bakery chimney could, and often did, burn down the entire neighborhood. The curfew bell, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, was a law requiring fires to be banked or covered at night. But the baker often had special dispensation to work early. This made him a target. If a fire started, the baker was often blamed, sometimes lynched by a mob who saw his oven as the mouth of hell that had consumed their homes. He worked in a fortress of brick, sweating, covered in dust, watching the red eye of the fire, knowing that one mistake could destroy the city. There's a tactile violence to the work. Watch the baker wielding the peel, the long-handled wooden shovel used to slide the loaves into the inferno. He thrusts it in and snaps it back with a wrist flick that takes years to master. He reaches into the heat, his arm hairs singed off long ago. He is dehydrated, constantly thirsty from the dry heat and the flour dust. He drinks ale to clear his throat, further blurring the line between the grain that is eaten and the grain that is drunk. The pests here are specific too. The mealworm beetle loves the warm, dark corners of the flour bin. The baker sifts them out, but their eggs remain. The crunch in a medieval loaf was not always the crust. It is a world of white dust and red fire, of heavy labor and heavy laws, where the simple act of making daily bread is a high-stakes gamble with the law, the lungs, and the flames. The bread is done now, stacked on the cooling racks, cracking softly as it cools, the song of the bread. But to make the bread rise, the baker needed the brewer, and it is to that liquid world we must now turn. For in the medieval kitchen, the safest thing to consume was not the food, but the drink. Step out of the white fog of the bakehouse and follow the heavy, sweet scent of malt drifting across the courtyard. We are entering the brewhouse, a space that feels less like a kitchen and more like a temple to a mysterious, bubbling deity. The air here is thick and humid, but unlike the stinging wood smoke of the main kitchen or the dry dust of the bakery, this humidity is fragrant. It smells of warm grain, steamy water, and the sharp, funky tang of fermentation. In the grand hierarchy of medieval survival, this room is the most critical fortress of all. It is the hydration station of the household. While the water carrier brings the liquid of death, the brewer transforms it into the liquid of life. To understand the medieval relationship with alcohol, we must discard the modern image of the pub or the bar. Brewing was not a recreational industry. It was a caloric necessity. It was liquid bread. The central figure here is often a woman, the alewife or brewster. In the domestic economy of the manor or the village, brewing was traditionally women's work, an extension of cooking. She stands over a massive copper vat, the mash tun, wielding a long wooden paddle. Her arms are strong, her face flushed with the steam. She is performing a daily miracle that no one in her time understands. She takes the suspect river water, heats it to a rolling boil, and mixes it with malted barley, grain that has been soaked, sprouted, and dried. This process creates a sweet, sugary liquid called wort. Here is the accidental brilliance of medieval hygiene. The boiling required to extract the sugars from the grain sterilizes the water. For an hour or more, the deadly pathogens, the cholera, the typhoid, the dysentery, are cooked into oblivion. The brewster does not know she is pasteurizing the water. She thinks she is just making it taste good. But in doing so, she is saving the lives of everyone in the castle. However, the safety is fleeting. Once the water is boiled, it must be cooled before the yeast is added. If you add yeast to boiling liquid, you kill it. So, the hot, sterile liquid is poured into large, shallow wooden trays called cool ships, a term that survives in modern brewing. These large surface areas allow the heat to escape quickly, but they also act as a landing pad for every airborne particle in the room. Dust from the rafters, soot from the fire, wild yeasts floating on the breeze, and yes, the ubiquitous housefly, all settle into the cooling brew. The brewster skims off the scum, but the inoculation has begun. She then adds the balm, or goddess good, the thick beige sludge of yeast saved from the previous batch. To the medieval mind, fermentation was not biology. It was a divine mystery. You put a dead, brown liquid in a tub, you added the magic sludge, and a day later, it was bubbling, churning, and alive. If the batch failed, if it turned sour or ropey, it wasn't blamed on contamination. It was blamed on a witch, a curse, or a brewster with a bad temper. The result of this process is not the clear fizzy lager of today. It is ale. Note the distinction. True medieval ale was made without hops, which were introduced later, slowly, from the continent. Hops are a preservative and add bitterness. Without them, ale was sweet, heavy, and extremely perishable. It would go sour within a week. This meant the brewhouse was in a state of perpetual production, brewing fresh batches every few days to keep up with demand. And the demand was staggering. A standard allowance for a castle servant, a monk, or a laborer was a gallon of ale a day. That is 8 pints. Before you imagine a population stumbling around in a drunken stupor, consider the small beer. This was the second or third running of the grain. After the strong ale was drained off, more water was added to the mash to extract the last remaining sugars. The resulting drink had a very low alcohol content, perhaps 1% or 2%. It was essentially a slightly boozy oatmeal water. This was the drink of children, pregnant women, and workers. It provided hydration and crucial B vitamins without the intoxication. It was safer than water, more nutritious than tea, which they didn't have, and cheaper than wine. But there was also the strong ale, the first running. This was the mind-numbing substance used for feasts and for deadening the pain of a hard life. And because ale was a staple, its quality was a matter of public concern. Enter the ale conner. This was an official appointed by the manor or the town to test the quality of the brew sold by commercial alewives. There is a delightful, persistent legend. Historians still debate its absolute literal truth, but it appears in enough folklore to be cherished about how they tested the ale. The story goes that the ale conner would pour a puddle of ale onto a wooden bench and sit in it wearing leather breeches. He would drink a tankard and wait. If, when he tried to stand up, his breeches stuck to the bench, the ale was deemed good because it was full of residual sugars. If he slid off easily, the ale was too thin and the brewster was fined. It is a humorous image, a civil servant gluing himself to furniture for the public good. But it underscores the fact that food standards were judged by texture and stickiness rather than chemical analysis. The brewhouse was not just a factory for drink, it was a recycling center. The spent grain, the mush left over in the tun after the sugar was extracted, was not thrown away. It was fed to the pigs and the cattle, fattening the animals that would eventually end up on the spit. The dregs or lees at the bottom of the barrel were used by the cook to thicken sauces or by the baker to raise bread. Nothing was wasted, but the dregs also posed a danger. Barrels were difficult to clean. A servant boy, small enough to fit, might be lowered inside a giant tun to scrub it with birch twigs and water. The fumes inside a fermenting vat, carbon dioxide, are deadly. There are records of servants passing out and suffocating silently in the invisible gas, or falling into boiling wads. The brewhouse killed in its own way, usually through industrial accidents rather than disease. There is a grim irony in the purity of ale. To flavor the unhopped drink and balance the sweetness, brewsters used crute, a mixture of herbs. This could include bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, and sometimes more questionable plants like wormwood or henbane. Henbane is a mild hallucinogen and a poison in large doses, so the safe daily drink might gently drug the consumer, contributing to the general fog of medieval consciousness. A laborer drinking a gallon of henbane-laced ale in the hot sun was operating in a very different mental space than a modern worker drinking water. As you stand in the brewhouse, breathing in the yeasty air, look at the wooden cups or leather blackjacks hanging on the wall. They are lined with pitch or resin to make them waterproof. When hot ale is poured into them, the resin softens, adding a flavor of tar to the drink. The ale itself is cloudy, full of suspended yeast and bits of grain husks. You have to chew it a little. But as the servants come in to fill their jugs, laughing and stealing a quick sip of the strong stuff when the brewster isn't looking, you realize that this room is the engine of the household's morale. It is the anesthetic for the toothaches, the backaches, and the cold nights. It is the calorie bomb that keeps the ploughman walking. The alewife wipes her hands on her apron, the same apron she likely wore to milk the cow or wipe a child's nose, and stirs the tun again. She is the chemist of the Dark Ages, managing enzymes and fungi with a wooden stick. She doesn't know why the liquid boils or why the foam rises. She only knows that if she stops, the house stops. The brewhouse is a sanctuary of controlled rot, a place where decay is harnessed to create euphoria. But euphoria is not health. And as the master of the house clutches his stomach after a meal of swan, verjuice, and strong ale, feeling the familiar burn of bad humors, he does not call for the brewster. He calls for the man of science, the one who claims to understand the stars and the body, but who is about to make everything much, much worse. Leave the noisy, yeasty warmth of the brewhouse and ascend the spiral stone stairs to the upper chambers, where the air is still and heavy with the scent of sickness. We are entering the domain of the physician, the man of science who stands between the patient and the grave, armed with a philosophy that is as elegant as it is deadly. The lord of the manor has fallen ill, a flux, a fever, a twisting in the gut that we, with our modern eyes, might identify as salmonella from the cutting board or lead poisoning from the wine jug. But the figure standing by the bedside sees none of this. He is dressed in long sweeping robes of expensive wool or velvet, a visual assertion of his authority. He does not look at the kitchen, he looks at the heavens. To understand the medieval medical mind, you must accept a premise that feels alien today. The body was not a biological machine, but a microcosm of the universe, governed by the same elemental forces that move the stars. The physician is not looking for bacteria, he is looking for balance. He operates under the ancient system of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is the perfect equilibrium of these fluids. Illness is a disruption, a dyscrasia, caused not by the rat droppings in the flour, but by a misalignment of the planets, a shift in the wind, or a moral failing of the patient. The kitchen, with all its filth, is invisible to him as a cause. He believes the stomachache comes from eating fruit that was too cold and moist for a choleric temperament, not from the unwashed hands of the fruit picker. Watch as he performs his primary diagnostic ritual, the uroscopy. He holds up a glass flask, the matala, filled with the patient's urine, tilting it against the light of the window. He is a piss prophet, a water caster. He studies the color, the clarity, the sediment, and the bubbles, in a practice that makes the modern stomach churn. He might even unstopper the flask and take a small sip, tasting for sweetness, a sign of the honey urine of diabetes or bitterness. He consults a folded parchment almanac hanging from his belt, a vademecum, which aligns the color of the urine with the position of the moon. It is a performance of immense gravity. He nods sagely, ignoring the fact that the flask itself was likely wiped clean with a dirty rag. He declares that the patient is suffering from an excess of blood, overheated by the consumption of red meat and spicy sauces. The diagnosis is plethora. The prescription is not an antibiotic, but an evacuation. The logic is terrifyingly simple. If the body is full of bad humors, the bad humors must be let out. This brings us to the barber surgeon. The academic physician often considers manual labor beneath him. He prescribes, but he does not cut. So a second figure enters the room, a man with rougher hands and a leather apron, carrying a bowl and a lancet. He is the man who shaves beards, pulls teeth, and opens veins. He ties a ligature around the Lord's arm until the vein swells, blue and angry. He does not sterilize the skin. He does not sterilize the knife. He wipes the blade on his apron, the same apron splashed with the blood of the previous 3 patients, and makes the incision. The blood spurts into the bowl. The theory is that this venting releases the toxic heat and pressure. In reality, they are draining the patient's fluids, lowering his blood pressure, and weakening his immune system at the exact moment he needs all his strength to fight the infection. If the patient faints, it is seen as a success. The agitation has been calmed. Historians estimate that for every life saved by bloodletting, and it can help in rare cases like hemochromatosis or severe hypertension, hundreds were hastened to their end. It was a medical assault disguised as a cure. If bleeding was not enough, there was the purge. The physician opens his box of medicines, the apothecary's chest. He mixes a draught of herbs designed to induce violent vomiting or diarrhea. Scammony, rhubarb, aloe, or even metallic poisons like antimony or mercury were used. The goal was to scour the body from the inside out. Imagine the scene. A man sick with food poisoning, already dehydrated from diarrhea, is given a toxic laxative to cleanse him. The logic was visual. If stuff is coming out, the sickness is coming out. They did not understand that they were stripping the gut lining and destroying the microbiome. The cure was often the final blow. And look at the tools: the spoons, the mortars, the pestles. They are porous wood or rough ceramic, rinsed in the same bucket of water between patients. The theriac, a complex wonder drug made of 64 ingredients, including viper flesh and opium, was kept in unsealed jars where mold could grow. The medicine itself was a vector of disease. There is a tragic irony in the dietary advice given during sickness. The physician, following the texts of Galen and Hippocrates, would often forbid the very things the patient needed. Fresh water was considered dangerous, which, to be fair, it often was. But the alternative, thick, syrupy wines or heavy ales, dehydrated the feverish body further. Fresh fruit and vegetables were banned as generators of wind and water, depriving the patient of vitamin C and electrolytes. Instead, the sick were fed white meats, blanched almonds, chicken breast, and sugar. Sugar was considered a medicine, a spice of immense power. They would sprinkle it on everything, feeding the bacteria in the gut with a pure carbohydrate rush. The invalid's diet was a recipe for scurvy and starvation. The sick room itself was a trap. The windows were sealed tight to keep out the pestilential air. Heavy tapestries were drawn around the bed to create a dark, warm cocoon. These curtains, unwashed for years, were dust traps, shaken only when the servants made the bed, releasing clouds of mites and old skin cells directly into the patient's face. The air in the room would become stagnant, a hot box of rebreathed germs. Family members would crowd in to say their goodbyes, leaning close to kiss the dying man, inhaling the aerosolized droplets of his cough, and then carrying the sickness back to their own chambers. The concept of quarantine existed, but usually only for leprosy or the Great Plague. For a flux, the community gathered round, sharing the cup and the air. Yet, we must not judge them too harshly. They were working with the tools they had. There is a scholar's debate here worth noting. Did medieval medicine work at all? Surprisingly, yes, sometimes. Amidst the astrology and the leeches, there was genuine botanical wisdom. Willow bark for pain, aspirin, honey for wounds, antibacterial, and mint for digestion. The wise woman in the village often had a better cure rate with her herbal teas than the university-trained physician with his star charts, simply because she didn't bleed her patients dry. But in the great houses, the book medicine ruled. The physician would consult his texts, reading aloud in Latin, a language the patient didn't understand, adding a layer of mystical authority to the proceedings. He might prescribe wearing a gemstone, like a sapphire or a toadstone, a fossilized fish tooth, against the skin to draw out the poison. The placebo effect was powerful. If you believe the expensive sapphire is working, your body might fight a little harder. But a sapphire cannot kill a streptococcus bacteria. As the physician packs up his astrolabe and his urine flask, collecting his fee, often a substantial sum of gold, he leaves the patient weaker, thirstier, and more anxious than before. The fire in the room burns low. The shadows lengthen. The servant brings a bowl of pottage that the patient is too weak to eat, and it sits on the bedside table, cooling, while a fly lands on the rim. The cycle continues. The filth of the kitchen has done its work, and the cleanliness of the science has failed to stop it. The medieval world is trapped in a loop of its own making, a closed system where the solution to the problem is often just another part of the problem. But change is coming. It does not come with a bang, but with a draft of air. High above the rooftops, something is being built that will alter the domestic landscape forever. The era of the smoke-filled hall is ending. The structure of the house is evolving, and with it, the very definition of what it means to be clean. The smoke is about to clear. The journey through the shadows of the medieval kitchen ends not with a sudden flash of light, but with a slow structural ascent. Look up at the roofline of the manor house as the 15th century bleeds into the 16th. Something is changing. The hole in the roof, that primitive vent that let the rain in and kept the smoke down, is disappearing. In its place, rising like a red brick finger pointing to the sky, is the chimney. It seems like a simple architectural detail, a tube of masonry, but it is the most significant revolution in domestic history since the invention of fire itself. The chimney changes the physics of the house. It captures the smoke, the soot, and the carbon monoxide, channeling them up and away from the lungs of the cook. Step back inside the kitchen now. The air is different. It is not the pristine, filtered air of a modern laboratory, but the stinging, blinding smother is gone. You can breathe without coughing. You can see the far wall, the great central hearth, the bonfire on the floor that dominated the room for 1,000 years, has been pushed to the side, tamed and enclosed within a wide stone fireplace. The fire is no longer a wild beast in the center of the room. It is a tool in a box. With the chimney comes the brick. The rough, porous stone walls that trapped the grease and the bacteria are slowly being replaced or covered by brick and plaster. These surfaces are smoother, harder, and easier to whitewash, and they do whitewash them. The rising influence of the Renaissance brings with it a new aesthetic of light. People begin to associate whiteness with cleanliness. It is a visual hygiene, still centuries away from germ theory, but it is a start. The kitchen begins to separate itself from the rest of the house. In the old medieval hall, the lord ate, slept, and lived in the smoke of the central fire, often just a few feet from where the dogs chewed the bones. Now the great hall is shrinking. Private dining rooms, parlors, and bedchambers are being partitioned off. The kitchen is becoming a specialized workspace, a back-of-house area distinct from the living quarters. The smells of the cooking no longer permeate every fabric of the household. The noise of the chopping and the swearing of the staff are contained behind closed doors. The segregation of service and master has begun, and with it, a barrier against the free flow of filth. Technological shifts ripple through the cookware. The heavy, crusted cauldrons are joined by more refined equipment. We see the emergence of the wafer iron, the predecessor of the waffle maker, and the specialized roasting jack that uses a clockwork mechanism, or the draft of the chimney to turn the spit, retiring the poor turn-spit dog and the blistered boy. The dog, thankfully, begins its slow evolution from kitchen engine to household pet. The potager, or stove, begins to appear in advanced households. A raised brick counter with holes for small charcoal fires, allowing the cook to control the heat with precision. He can now simmer a delicate sauce without it boiling over into the ashes. Cooking is moving from an act of brute force survival to an art of temperature control. Hygiene, too, undergoes a subtle shift. The writings of scholars like Erasmus, who mocked the filthy rush-covered floors, begin to take root. The rushes are swept out more frequently, or replaced entirely by woven mats or even bare wooden floorboards that can be scrubbed. The marsh beneath the feet is drying out. The use of soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, becomes more common for laundry and scrubbing surfaces, if not yet for personal bathing. The fork makes its tentative arrival from Italy. At first, it is ridiculed as an effeminate, unnecessary tool. Why use gold tines when God gave you fingers? But its utility in keeping sticky, greasy food off the hands eventually wins out. The chain of infection from hand to mouth is interrupted, just for a moment. The communal bowl, into which everyone dipped their spoon and their thumb, begins to give way to individual pewter or wooden plates. The boundaries between mine and yours are solidifying, and in doing so, the bacterial exchange is slowed. But let us not romanticize this dawn too heavily. The rats are still there, though perhaps fewer now that the food is stored in better sealed pantries. The flies still buzz in the summer heat. The water is still drawn from the suspicious river. The understanding of why people get sick is still mired in the stars and the humors. The miasma theory will persist for hundreds of years, leading people to fear the smell of a sewer more than the water within it. But the crushing, suffocating darkness of the deep Middle Ages is lifting. The kitchen is no longer a cave, it is a room. It has windows with glass, letting in the sun. It has a floor that doesn't squelch. It has a chimney that breathes. The filthy truth we have explored, the smoke, the rot, the parasites, is not erased, but it is being managed. The human drive for order, for comfort, and for survival is pushing back the entropy. Historians often debate when the Middle Ages truly ended in the kitchen. Some say it was the potato, others say it was the cast iron stove. But standing here, watching the smoke curl lazily up the new brick chimney, we can see the turning point. The survival rate of children begins to tick upward, glacially but surely. The great famines become less frequent as trade routes open up and food storage improves. The diet diversifies. The pottage is joined by salads, pastries, and chemically raised breads. The culinary world is expanding. The kitchen has done its job. It has kept humanity alive through the plague years, through the mini ice age, through the wars and the filth. It was a brutal, unforgiving crucible, a place where life was sustained by death, where the soup was a biological hazard, and where the floor was a grave. But it worked. We are here today, sleeping in our clean, climate-controlled rooms, because those blackened, coughing cooks kept the fires burning. As the camera of our mind pulls back, leaving the kitchen behind, we see the castle not as a fortress of war, but as a home. The lights in the windows are extinguishing one by one. The servants are banking the fires, covering the embers with ash to keep them sleeping until morning, the origin of the word curfew. The noise of the spit has stopped. The dogs are asleep. The rats are beginning their nightly patrol, but we are leaving them to it. We float up past the chimney pots into the cool, clean night air of history. The smoke disperses into the stars. The centuries fold over the scene, bearing the rushes and the bones, leaving only the stories. The struggle for a clean meal, a warm fire, and a safe home is the oldest story of all. And tonight, that story has been told. And so, the fire dims. The heavy oak door swings shut, latching with a soft, final click, sealing the past inside the stone. You are no longer standing on the damp rushes or breathing the wood smoke. You are here, in the present, wrapped in the safety of your own time. The air around you is clean and still. The shadows in your room are not hiding anything but the quiet of the night. Let the tension drain from your shoulders, just as the smoke drifted from the chimney. The history is done. The work is finished. There is nothing left to carry, no water to haul, no fire to tend. You are warm, you are safe, you are at rest. Let the silence of the centuries settle over you like a heavy, soft blanket. The world is turning slowly in the dark, and you are drifting with it, down into the deep, dreamless velvet of sleep. Sweet dreams.